Hi, welcome to week 7 of Colonial Latin American History. So today we're talking about the conquest as an ongoing process, right? Not one that has a clear beginning and a clear ending. And to illustrate that, I'm just going to focus on one group of people, the Mapuche, which Restall and Lane talk about briefly in the textbook chapter that you're assigned to read for this week. So when we learn about the conquest, we are often taught about the Aztec and the Inca, the great sedentary societies that constructed incredible cities and impressive architecture that stands today. We rarely discuss other groups like the non-sedentary and semi-sedentary societies. Why is that? I would argue because those histories trouble traditional narratives. They complicate our understanding of how the so-called conquest of the Americas happened. They trouble our understanding of the process of conquest and the process of colonization. They're not neat histories. That, however, is exactly why we need to talk about them. So let's talk about the Mapuche of southern Chile. And make sure to reference the PowerPoint as I talk, because I have some maps and images of the people I'm going to talk about. So, how was Mapuche society organized before the arrival of the Spanish? The Mapuche and their antecedents had lived in the pampas of South America for nearly 15,000 years. They were semi-sedentary. They relied on hunting and agriculture. They lived alongside a forest that provided wood for them to build houses and construct defensive buildings. And their social order is, like most semi-sedentary societies, relatively egalitarian. Their leaders didn't have a lot of power to control or make demands on the people, and the people could largely do as they pleased. They lived in small groups that periodically raided each other. The Mapuche society prized military action. Boys were taught to take captives, and girls to stockpile supplies, and Restall and Lane talk about that. They also had a history of banding together to resist invaders, and I think this is a really fascinating history. In the 1480s, for example, the Mapuche banded together to fight back against the Incas, and they effectively blocked the Incan Empire's expansion southward, so that this Incan Empire ends around 36 parallel, which is where the Mapuche are. The Mapuche still exist to this day. In terms of their religion, they worshipped deities that represented forces of nature, like the harvest, etc. So what did the Spanish conquest of Chile look like? It was led by Pedro de Valdivia, who gets a license to conquer Chile from Pizarro, but not many people want to join him. He ultimately gathers about 150 people with him and leaves to move southward in 1540. In 1541, he founds the capital city of Santiago, and when gold is found soon after that, Spaniards began to pour in, and they found great little towns. They really rely heavily on exploiting the local population to get at the gold, which is very rich in this region. Yet, despite this, the area south of the Rio Biobío would remain outside of Spanish and then later Chilean control until about the 1880s. How is that possible? How were the Mapuche able to stay independent and autonomous for so long? So they actually rise up and destroy Santiago in 1541, the year that it's founded. They are angered by the exploitation. The indigenous people of the area attack and then overwhelm the small number of men defending the city. And here's where the conquistadora Inés Suárez appears. She was Valdivia's mistress, and she rallies the men of Santiago. She orders the execution of 7 cacique hostages and then throws their heads to the attackers in order to create disorder and gives the Spanish a chance to attack them. Valdivia then pushes south in a bid to control Mapuche territory. He builds these fortresses. But the Mapuche are watching and they are adapting to the Spanish. So let me give you some examples of how they did this. The first was that they adopted Spanish horses, which increased their mobility and their ability to conduct raids. They learned to ride 2 to a horse so that one could control the horse and the other could control or shoot shoot the bow and arrow. They also learned to use guns, swords, and knives. They would steal metal from the settlers to place on their spears. They killed Spanish cattle in order to create leather armors and helmets. And they perfected the art of the ambush and conducting night raids. And Spaniards would call this guerrilla, or little warfare, guerrilla warfare. One of the leaders of the Mapuche was a man by the name of Lautaro, who actually worked for Valdivia. He was in charge of his horses, he groomed the horses, and from this position he learned how the Spanish fought, and he pioneered a new form of warfare. He divided the Mapuche into separate units to constantly attack the Spanish and tire out their horses. And using this tactic, they were able to ultimately defeat Valdivia in 1553 and execute him. The Spanish aren't able to get control of the forts near the river until 1557, but even then the Mapuche continue to attack and destroy Spanish settlements. And they'll live in a state of war for the next 150 years. In the late 1500s, the Mapuche band together to form a confederacy with neighboring tribes, and the Spanish actually called them the Indomitable State. They killed the Spanish governor, and by 1600 they've destroyed all of the Spanish towns that existed south of the Rio Biobío. And southern Chile becomes a permanent frontier zone where the Spanish are on the defensive. So how are the Spanish and the Mapuche able to coexist? Well, the Indomitable State, for one, it expands over time. Via marriage and trade, the Mapuche expand sort of their control and expand their allies. In fact, the language of the Mapuche is spoken even in Argentina. Spain still tries to control the area, and they do this by legalizing the enslavement of indigenous people to try to draw in Spaniards who will then capture indigenous people and enslave them. They allow the encomienda to continue in Chile, but eventually the Spanish are forced to recognize the Mapuche's autonomy. In fact, by the time Chile declares its independence from Spain in the 1810s, 1/3 of what becomes the nation of Chile is actually under indigenous control and was never under Spanish control. In order to preserve sort of their control of this region and to preserve the peace for the Spaniards would hold parlamentos. These were periodic summits to renew the peace between the two people, between the two groups. Thousands of people would gather and the Spanish would host, provide food and wine, exchange gifts. The Spanish wanted the indigenous alliances and help sometimes, particularly to stop English invaders, and so they proposed creating Mapuche ambassadors. And the Mapuche worked with the Spanish because they wanted their autonomy, they didn't want to pay taxes, and they also wanted Spanish support and alliance in their battles with other indigenous caciques, so it was kind of a mutually beneficial relationship. And this is how the Mapuche and the Spanish existed side by side, like I said, for over 100 years. So I bring up this history, and I think it's so fascinating because it really complicates our understanding of the conquest, right? We cannot say that the conquest ended in this certain year, in this specific time period. And we can't even say that with the conquest of the Inca and Aztec empires that the Spanish conquered Latin America. Because they didn't. They simply did not control vast swaths of territory. And you'll read about that in Restall and Lane. In Townsend, you're going to read about how even though the Spanish control what was the Aztec and Inca Empire, that doesn't mean they exert total control. So as you read, I want you to think about the different ways that indigenous groups are responding to the Spanish, how they're resisting their rule. So with that, I'm going to leave off. I'm really looking forward to reading your essay exams. Good luck. If you have questions, you know how to find me.